everyone here, and we're especially excited to have Professor Hannah Wohl as our guest this week. I hope everyone is doing well at the end of this first month of 2022. We are cold here in Indiana, but I know that Hannah's warm out in the West Coast, and she's going to be presenting to us today about her work on sort of creativity, valuing it, and having her very interesting perspective on how this is playing out, and hopefully be able to talk a bit about her new book that is out. So we're really excited to have that conversation. I don't need to do any more except hand the mic over to her and moderate questions as they come in. Feel free to put them in the chats, or when Hannah wraps up, we'll call on people if they want to raise their Zoom hand or actual hands. But also feel free to send me questions in the chat and I'll compile them for later. So with no further ado, here is Hannah Wohl from UCSB. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that introduction. And like I was saying when we were talking in our small group, it's really a pleasure to be here. There's not that many spaces that are particularly focused on cultural affairs. So this is really a rare pleasure for me to talk to this group. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and get that started. All right. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on covering some of the main ideas in my book, Bound by Creativity, which was published in June by University of Chicago Press. And this is the book cover with cover art from artist B. Wirtz, who is one of my subjects who you'll meet in a bit. So I titled this talk, What is Creativity? And the idea of creativity is social. So while we can think of creativity more broadly, we more narrowly designate creativity to a certain scope of decisions made by people who are in particular roles. So in creative industries, this is something that artists or creative producers do when they make creative products. So when I'm addressing this question in the realm of creative industries, I'm really asking, how do artists make decisions during the creative process? In this process, artists are making aesthetic decisions that ultimately result in creative products. And when I talk about aesthetic judgments here, I mean judgments about what constitutes a good work of art. So while other forms of judgment, like economic judgments, can also impact the creative process, aesthetic judgments are key motivators of creative decision making. And I think aesthetic judgment has not received enough attention in sociology compared to other forms of judgment, like moral judgment or economic judgment. Okay, so the contemporary art market is a particularly interesting field to examine aesthetic judgment in the creative process because there's very little consensus in the contemporary art world about what counts as good art. So this is a field where anything goes. It's not necessarily about making something beautiful or even something that requires technical skill, but instead about capturing an idea with a form. And we're not really clear even about when forms capture these ideas in an original or compelling way. So we're not judging what counts as aesthetically pleasing, but what kinds of forms capture an abstract theory, an emotion, or a theme, and even that is really uncertain. These are some photos from my ethnography, and as you can see here, a work of art could be a pile of rubble, it can be a clothesline of socks, and these works can sell for thousands or sometimes millions of dollars. So sociologists have previously been interested in studying this bizarre world of contemporary art to see how pricing and economic valuation happens under these conditions of extreme aesthetic uncertainty. But I'm interested in how artists make aesthetic judgments themselves during the creative process, in the absence of clear criteria for what makes art good or bad. So I argue that we need to understand how aesthetic judgments shape the creative process. And this led me to three questions. First, how do artists make aesthetic judgments about their own work as they experiment in the often solitary realm of their studios? And studies of creative production tend to focus on sites where multiple people collaborate to make creative products, like restaurant kitchens or jazz clubs. So previous research like Howard Becker's Art Worlds approach and Richard Peterson's production of culture approach focus on how collaboration with others during the creative process results in particular works, and how various organizational properties of cultural fields shape creative decisions. This is all really important, but it draws attention away from actual aesthetic judgments in the creative process. So studying contemporary visual artists encouraged me to focus on this because unlike chefs or jazz musicians, visual artists spend a lot of time making work alone in their studios, even if some of them have studio assistants. So second, how do these aesthetic judgments unfold over time as artists consider their past works and form ideas for future works? So most studies of aesthetic judgment focus on isolated moments of decision-making, usually in the process of distributing or consuming creative products rather than in the process of production. For example, sociologists have studied how an editor decides whether or not to publish a certain book, or how socioeconomic status shapes the music we select. And again, these are really important questions, but they don't help us answer how aesthetic judgments unfold during the creative process. So studying the creative process entails studying a sequence of interlocking judgments over time because artists make a series of decisions as they produce a work, and these decisions are shaped by decisions they have made about previous work. And then lastly, how are these aesthetic judgments shaped by others' evaluations of previous work that circulate through the art world? So while I'm studying the creative process that largely occurs in solitude, this does not mean that these processes are asocial. By examining how artists' understandings of others' evaluations shape the creative process, we can explore creativity as a social process while also keeping the focus on aesthetic judgment itself. So my approach entails studying aesthetic judgment in a way that's focused on creative production, attends to the judgments as they unfold over time, and captures how these judgments are relational. So let's move to the data now. And I conducted my research in New York City, which is the epicenter of the contemporary art world, although this is a globalized market, where both competition and the potential payoffs in terms of money and prestige are greatest. I interviewed over 100 artists, dealers, curators, collectors, and art advisors. And because I'm discussing specific works of art, I use subjects' real names with their permission. I selected artists working in different media and styles, as well as differing in statuses. I also conducted 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork. So I focused on sites where works were produced by making repeated visits to artist studios. And I also focused on sites where works were selected for exhibition and selection, or exhibition and collection, such as exhibition installations in galleries, exhibition openings, art fairs that people travel from all over the world to attend, and VIP parties for collectors. The contemporary art world is a center of elite culture. So most works are priced in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars. Collectors usually own thousands of works at these price points. And in fact, they only consider themselves collectors once they have a storage unit for their art. These photos show the process of installing an exhibition. This is just photos from my fieldwork here. Socializing in artist studios, going to art fairs and parties with collectors. And the picture on the bottom right might look like a museum. This is actually the home of a private collector in Manhattan. And as you can probably tell from the photos on the left of artists versus those on the right of collectors, these are really, really different social scenes. So it was very interesting as an ethnographer to traverse these social spaces and also watch them collide as artists interact with collectors and others in the art world. So artists are going to art fairs and parties with collectors, and collectors are going into artist studios. I interviewed all artists in their studios, and often I would return to the studio every few months to see how their work had changed. So these are usually messy and hectic spaces, as you can see in the photo on the bottom right with chickens. Sometimes there are studio assistants who are preparing a canvas or plugging something into a database, but most of the time artists are alone here. And studios are usually packed with art in different stages of progress, including source material, sketches and models, unfinished work, as well as abandoned work and finished work. And these works in different stages were important for me methodologically because they allowed me to probe how artists made decisions at various stages of the creative process. So during interviews, we would go through works on display, and I would ask them to tell me about a certain sketch or an unfinished work, and we talk about the decisions that they had made with that work. I was also able to see these decisions over time when I would return to studios or visit artist exhibitions. And so I could see the changes in certain works and ask about what had happened to them. So I'm going to move to the analysis now. And I'm first going to show how people in the art world discuss what creativity is. And I'm going to highlight this idea of having a creative vision. These narratives of creativity are important because they influence how artists experiment in their studios, because this is the way they think about creativity. Then I'm going to move into the studio, and I'll show how artists use a process of experimentation that results in what they view as having a creative vision. And I'll show how the structure of the creative process itself ultimately reinforces certain ways of judging creativity. Finally, I'll show how, as artists' work circulates in the art world over time, these collective orientations of judging creativity and these perceptions of particular artists' creative visions can constrain what artists can produce. So taken together, I'll show how artists don't just experiment with infinite possibilities, even though we're in this world where quote unquote anything goes, but they experiment within a set of parameters that they develop over time through experimentation, which is informed by their interaction in the art world. Ultimately, creativity is bound by the idea of creativity itself and the structure of the creative process. So let's jump into the art world now. I'll start by looking at how creativity is judged within the art world. And as I'll show, people in the art world discuss good artists as those who have artistic autonomy, aesthetic commitment, and continued experimentation. And together they see these as the mark of a true creative vision. So the first quote here is from a dealer at a critically acclaimed gallery in Chinatown. We're sitting in the back room of the gallery in the evening after the gallery has closed, and she's stuck at work waiting for an artist who is currently missing their meeting. So she vents to me, they are fucking psycho, lazy, useless, undependable. Okay, so artists sometimes, it's probably not their fault that they are completely incapable of taking care of themselves. And actually, they are just in a permanent childlike state, and actually making art and having someone else sell for them is the only way that they could ever survive as people, because they would otherwise be homeless. And I guess they can kind of be visionary and inspiring in one way or another, but they are those kind of really hopeless people. Okay, so in her narrative, we get this image of the artist as someone who is an incompetent person, very pejorative, who cannot deal with normal adult responsibilities, but also has the saving grace of being a quote visionary. And this is another dealer in an established gallery in Chelsea talking about the role of dealers in relation to the artists that their gallery represents. We are not co-producers of the artwork. So a good dealer is not trying to influence the way something is going to be created, because you are just going to cloud that. If that artist is looking to their dealer for advice on how to paint something, there is no place for them in this art world. They need to trust their own vision. So you can't be like, I think that should be blue. So this dealer is saying that the true artists have to follow their own vision, which can't be dictated by others. I want to highlight a couple points here. First, artists are seen to be incapable of dealing with non-creative aspects of their professional lives, such as financial decisions. And this is structured organizationally into the art world. For example, artists represented by dealers do not set their own prices and often don't even know the prices of their work. However, there is a supposed sphere of aesthetic autonomy surrounding the artist. Artists are supposed to be able to make their own creative visions and be able to find their own way in the studio without having others tell them what to do. And dealers were expected to respect this. This is also organizationally structured. For example, even though dealers often knew what was more marketable, they would find indirect ways to tell artists this, and even sometimes show work that they did not think would sell. So there's a sphere of aesthetic autonomy, and within this space, artists are supposed to produce a vision. And what we see emerging is this idea that the true artists have a creative vision, and this is what makes their work original and aesthetically important. So supporting this concept of the creative vision is the idea that true artists have an enduring obsession with or commitment to certain aesthetic themes. So this collector and I visited a studio of an emerging artist in Queens together. The artist spent several years making sculptures of pink pillbox hats meticulously positioned to mirror the trajectory of Jackie O's hat during JFK's assassination. And she did this by analyzing 7 seconds of film footage frame by frame. So we're in the studio and the collector says to the artist, "You're still not done." And the artist says, "No, every time I finish one, I have to make another. I probably have between 4 and 6 left in this section of film." And the collector says, "Oh God, I'm overwhelmed." And later in the studio visit, the collector says, "What galleries have come through? What about Tanya Banakdard? She would love this." And the artist says, "I would love an introduction. I haven't really sought out a gallery. I've just been working." The collector says, "As you should be." And the artist says, "I'm a bit of a cave dweller." And later, the collector and I are in the taxi going back to Manhattan, and the collector says, "She's obsessed." So here we see both the artist and the collector emphasizing the artist's obsession with this theme, and we also see the artist downplaying professional savviness. Together, the artist and the collector communicate their view that continuing to explore the same themes over time represents aesthetic obsession, and that this is the mark of a true creative vision. So collectors like doing studio visits also with artists in part because they felt like getting to know the artist personally and seeing their studio space gave them further insight into artist's creative vision, because the artist's creative vision was supposed to be associated with the artist's identity as a person. So while consistency is seen as the mark of a true artist, artists are also expected not to take this too far. So here I was walking around a major contemporary art fair with a collector and several of the collector's friends. The collector stopped in one booth and said to his friends, "That's a John Pistone. It has that look. It doesn't look like anyone else. I could tell right away just by glancing." He added cat litter to his paintings to give it a wonderful rough texture. It brought it up a notch. What makes a great artist? You progress. He struggles. If you talk to him, he's like, "I don't know." And with any artist, not everything he makes is incredible, but he self-edits. So here we can see that there's this consistency because he can tell that it's a Pistone just by seeing the image, but he also highlights that the artist is willing to continue to experiment, even to the point of floundering or failing. So in this narrative, consistency is seen to be evidence of aesthetic commitment, and variation is seen to be evidence of a willingness to experiment. In the art world, it was not enough to have either aesthetic commitment or a willingness to experiment. Instead, this was something artists needed to balance and manage this balance over time. So we get to this idea of a creative vision, which is also in the art world sometimes called a signature style. And I define this as what people perceive as a bundle of recognizable and enduring elements within an artist's body of work. People believe that creative visions also evolve over time. So the creative vision embodies values of both aesthetic commitment and experimentation. This value placed on the creative vision is not just a post hoc justification for why people value the work of artists who are already seen as high status, but something that actually influences people's aesthetic judgments. For example, I saw collectors pass up new works by well-known artists whose work they already owned because they felt like the new series either was too much of a departure from the artist's previous work or that the artist's work hadn't changed enough. So narratives of creativity influenced how artists experimented in the studio and also reinforced how artists experimented. And I'm now going to bring us into the studio so we can see how this is enacted in the creative process, how an artist creates a body of work that is seen to have a true creative vision, because artists know that these are the values that they're supposed to embody within their work. So here we're going to see how artists use certain processes of experimentation to create these to make these creative visions that are deemed to have this balance of consistency and variation that I just discussed. So artists recognized that the creative process was highly uncertain. When they experimented with new elements, like a new material or technique, they could not quite imagine what result they were going to get. This uncertainty was a risk. They needed to produce work that would be judged as representing a unique creative vision, so they couldn't spend all of their time and money making work that others wouldn't want to buy. To manage this uncertainty, they used what I call low-stakes experimentation. In other words, they tested out ideas efficiently by using fast processes of production and inexpensive materials. So some common examples of low-stakes experiments are sketches and models. In this image, you can see artist Davina Samo's work. These are big pieces of leather, which she would pour hot cement over. Here are some leather test strips she made to see how the leather would react to the cement at different thicknesses. And here are a few full-scale works. She began by producing smaller squares and then made larger squares. She started repeating certain elements while varying other conditions. And as she did, she reduced uncertainty in various elements because she learned how to predict the leather to react to different techniques. So for example, she thought that this mottled effect on the leather, which you can see on the left-hand side, was due to the cement dyeing the leather. But when she varied the color of the leather, she realized that it was actually the hot cement burning the leather. As she understood different elements, she started incorporating multiple elements into the same piece, such as hanging chains from the paintings or even molding the cement around the chains. So this process of testing individual elements and then adding them together allowed for more formal complexity. And she used a process of holding certain elements constant while varying other elements in order to test their effects. So this is like a simple experiment that we would use in science. So we can see how artists allowed for heightened uncertainty during low stakes experimentation, and then they reduce their uncertainty later in the creative process as they develop what I call creative competencies, or more refined expectations of material results through repeated testing. As artists repeated certain elements across different works, they created consistencies within their bodies of work. And consistencies were crucial to developing creative competencies or better predictions of material results so that they could have more control over the creative process. So artists' ideas about what was relevant to their creative visions allowed or guided initial low stakes experimentation. And this is a quote from artist B. Wirtz, whose work you saw on my book cover. B says, "I felt I needed to limit the scope of what was available to me in terms of found objects. Found objects are like everyday objects that people incorporate into art, because it was just too overwhelming. And it makes you have more freedom in a way because you have to be more inventive with what you do. If you limit it, then you have to think of other things to do." B's work was composed around the themes of bare necessities, what he called eating, drinking, and staying warm. His work involved mostly sculptures made of different mundane objects like clothing or kitchenware, and he would incorporate these with wood, metal, wire, and other materials. B's perception that these materials and themes were relevant to his creative vision arose through the process of experimentation and then channeled future low-stakes experimentation. Putting parameters on his source material allowed him to do low-stakes experiments in an effective way because it made the possibilities not limitless. And this is another reason why consistencies occurred during the creative process. As he produced new work, he looked back on his body of work to identify further consistencies. This was important in order to create a coherent narrative of his creative vision to himself and others. Here, B is talking about recognizing consistencies in his work during the process of putting together a retrospective exhibition, which is a big solo exhibition that covers multiple previous series. B said, "I hadn't seen so much of it over such a long period together like that ever before. And I was really surprised at how weirdly consistent I had been. And that was interesting to me because I thought, this is really who I am, but it wasn't just repeating either." So we can see here that artists started by experimenting with ideas that they thought might be relevant to their creative visions. And the process of experimentation itself required them to repeat certain elements so that they could see how these elements would react to different materials and techniques. And they then look back at their body of work and recognize consistencies, which further strengthens their perception that these elements characterize distinctive creative visions. and they become more committed to these elements. But as we saw, artists could not just use the same themes over and over because they would get bored and other people would see their creative visions as stagnant. They needed a way to introduce variations into the creative process while at the same time making works seem still representative of their creative visions. So B explains here how he took on new challenges by incorporating materials that he did not normally use. And B says, I started with this because someone gave this to me. He's talking about this pink plastic toy. Some friend had it and he thought, oh, B would like that. And so he said, oh, you can have it. So he gave me that. And this is not something I would normally, well, okay, I use these kinds of hanging things, but not like a pink one. So this is a little different, a little weird. And I say, yeah, it's a little too plasticky, fabricated. And B says, yeah, kid-like. And so I thought, oh, this is an interesting challenge. What can I do with it? So I had this idea, okay, I think I'll hang wooden clothespins from it. And then I thought, now how am I going to display it? So it was going to be like a smaller thing with something holding it. And then I thought, well, I'll make this bigger structure and then it needs more height. So we can see here how he's trying to expand his body of work by experimenting with a new element, which here is a pink plastic toy, which is something that he says he would not normally use. So B built this whole structure, which you can see on the left-hand side, around the plastic toy in an effort to make it fit within his body of work. These wood, the clothespins are things he would more normally use. But when I returned a few months later, the structure was still there, but the pink toy had been removed and replaced with a cloth napkin. The napkin was related to the concept of domesticity, which was prevalent in his work, and was also more sort of natural fabric, more similar palette to what he usually used. So this was a case where an artist tried, but ultimately did not use a new element because the artist could not experiment to a point where he felt like the work was both representative of his enduring commitment and his desire for continued experimentation. So he ultimately felt like the work wasn't representing his creative vision. A couple months later, when I visited B, he was working on this new piece, which he called Kitchen Trees. B was invited to do a public art sculpture for the Public Art Fund, an arts nonprofit in New York City, which was ultimately displayed in City Hall Park in downtown Manhattan. The work had to be large scale and weatherproof, which created a challenge since he usually made small sculptures with everyday objects. He had to figure out how to make it fit with his creative vision while also incorporating new elements. So ultimately, he made this work out of durable materials like colander and plastic vegetables that still connected to themes of domesticity. As we can see, artists use processes of experimentation that allow them to produce and recognize consistencies that they associate with their creative visions, while also introducing new elements that they eventually also come to associate with their creative vision. Their creative vision becomes something that artists and others can recognize without being static. Artists' processes of experimentation are influenced by narratives of creativity, but narratives of creativity are also influenced by how artists and others perceive the creative process. For example, dealers are exposed to the creative process through their interactions with artists and studio visits. They see that different artists have different levels of creative output based on their techniques and also go through ebbs and flows in the creative process. Dealers develop organizational practices around these understandings of the creative process, like having different artists exhibit their work with different frequencies and somewhat flexible exhibition schedules. While artists can, in theory, experiment with infinite elements, in practice, artists' actual creative processes are bound by different ways. So I'll end by discussing the different ways that the creative process is bound by the social world. As we have seen, artists are influenced by narratives of creativity that circulate in the art world. And as artists experiment in their studios, they repeat certain elements and associate their work with elements in a way that they come to see as parameters on the kind of work they make. So practices of experimentation also bound the creative process. And finally, as work leaves the studio, we'll now see how other people's perceptions of specific creative visions place further boundaries on how artists experiment. I'll discuss this last point using the case of Catherine Bernhard. Catherine first became known for her sloppily painted fashion models as shown here, which sold well and received positive reviews. After a couple of years, Catherine felt like she was finished with these works and began making collaborative works with her husband, consisting of collaging African textiles on canvas, which she referred to as rug paintings, as seen on the right-hand corner of the photo with Catherine and her son. So Catherine described the difficulty in exhibiting and selling the rug paintings. She says, Canada, this is her gallery name, said that they wanted to show paintings only from me, not collaborative works. When they told me that, I was only making collages. So I was like, whatever, I am making collages. So I made them anyway. And we had a show at the Wohl, and the Wohl is a lesser known gallery in Brooklyn that's sort of the sister gallery of Canada. After the collages, Canada was still like, we want a painting show, painting, painting, painting. So I was like, okay, and I came up with this. So having witnessed these kinds of conversations, it's likely that the dealer said it in a more indirect way, but this was the clear message that she took away. Catherine showed me her new series, paintings filled with cigarettes, lipsticks, and juice boxes in the same sloppily painted style as her previous series of models. And she told me that the series sold out. Although Catherine initially sidestepped Canada's refusal of her new works by continuing to produce rug collages, she ultimately returned to producing series in her more recognizable painting style and exhibiting them at Canada. A year later, I walked into Canada's booth at Frieze, one of New York's biggest fairs, and asked the dealer the price of Catherine's two paintings of toilet paper, tacos, and Pac-Man, one of which is pictured here on the far wall, as well as the price of her 3 rug collages, one of which is pictured here on the near wall. He replied that the paintings cost $25,000 and $30,000 each, but that the rug collages were only $6,000 each. Why the price discrepancy, I asked. They're about the same size. Well, she's really more noted for these kinds of paintings, he explained. So we see here that when artists become known for certain kinds of work, this is the work that is most in demand and priced the highest. And this is because collectors value the artist for what they believe is original about the work, which they view as represented by the creative vision. As we saw from looking at the creative vision or creative process, developing creative competencies in order to make a new series takes a lot of time and effort, and artists can risk being judged as not committed enough to the new idea for it to be considered a core part of their creative vision. So artists who become noted for certain elements can face challenges when they try to introduce new variations, even if, in theory, dealers and collectors think that they should be free to experiment. So artists' distinctive creative visions arise through the ongoing creative process through which artists experiment and identify with certain core and enduring elements. I started with this question of how artists make creative decisions without a consensus in the field about what is good art. And artists deal with this by sidestepping objectivity when it comes to aesthetic judgment. When I started this project, I asked artists to tell me about work that was good or bad. And it took me some time to realize that this question wasn't working well and why it wasn't working well. Artists don't view their artwork as objectively good or bad. Instead, they judge it in terms of its relevance to their distinctive creative visions. In the art world, this idea of having a creative vision, which is demonstrated by aesthetic autonomy and a balance of consistency and variation, is important. Artists' perceptions of their creative visions arise through the process of experimentation. Through these moment-to-moment decisions, artists develop a cluster of consistencies within their bodies of work, which they recognize as their creative vision or signature style. Excuse me. Ultimately, creativity is bound by ideas of creativity itself, other people's perceptions of specific artists' creative visions, and artists' own identifications of their creative visions during the creative process. More broadly, I propose an approach to theorizing the creative process as a sequence of judgments directed towards objects that is oriented by social values. And this I see as both a theoretical approach and a methodology. So to break this down a bit more, excuse me, we see a sequence of judgments. So I think it's important for those studying judgment not only to focus on discrete moments of judgment, but instead to look at how multiple moments of judgment are linked together. In the creative process, artists don't just conceive of an object and then execute it, but instead make a sequence of decisions in response to an evolving object. Methodologically, I think this can be captured by focusing not only on judgments of completed works, but also tracing the intermediate products like sketches and models throughout the creative process. Directed towards objects. So as I said, these judgments are attached to evolving objects, which requires attention to the materiality of the object and how multiple people's judgments of the same object intersect. And then finally, oriented by social values. So even when artists are alone, their judgments are oriented by broader orientations towards judgments that are influenced by their social interactions. So for example, ideas about what a creative vision is and why it is valuable shape how artists judge particular works. And I see these gaps as a way that we currently in the way that we currently theorize aesthetic judgments. This approach allows for aesthetic judgment to be theorized in production as relationally influenced and also as temporally linked. All right, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to stop my screen share. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, and I'd love to hear if you have any comments or questions.
Thank you, Hannah. Very nice, very nice. So comments and questions from the room, the virtual room. It's a very interesting presentation. Maybe as people are typing them into the chat or figuring out how to raise their hand, I want to ask you a quick clarifying question or something. It was near one of your concluding slides. You listed, I think, 3 things that bound creativity. Can you repeat those? I didn't get them all down.
Yeah, definitely. Let me make sure I remember them. So the first one is sort of narratives of creativity. So artists think about creativity in certain ways, and that influences how they experiment because they want to like uphold and sort of live up to the values of what creativity is in their mind. But those are narratives that are sort of socially circulating in the art world. They are created by artists, but also created by other people, and they all sort of circulate in this sort of soup. So narratives of creativity is the first thing. The second thing is the process of experimentation itself. And I think there is like this underlying process that is both influenced by the narratives of creativity, but also influences the narratives of creativity because the artists are having, contact with their own creative process, and other people are coming into the studio and understanding how they see the creative process. And that process that artists use, especially of repeating certain elements, creates consistencies, but also variations. And then the third is other people's perceptions of specific creative visions as they circulate through the art world. So artists circulate their work and people say like, oh, Hannah does this kind of work. That's a Wohl that I can tell right away. And those perceptions are good, like you want recognition, but they can also, artists often experience them as being pigeonholed in various ways. And so they have various ways of dealing with this. And I mean, I can go more into this, but it can also change over the course of their career because this sort of type of recognition changes over the career, and that places different kinds of constraints on artists at different career stages.
Great, thank you. And that got us time for other questions to come in. And Tim Gill has a question that I wanted to ask. I'm going to read his question. I wanted your comments on generalizability. So Tim asks, do you see your work extending to other art worlds? He says it seems pretty consistent with music and music reviews. He says it seems that folks want to see bands have consistency across albums, but not too much, and yet not too much experimentation either, so that they can't recognize who it's from. So what are your thoughts on extending this to other art worlds?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked about sort of the generalizability of this. Yeah, so I absolutely think it extends, especially um, worlds where originality is highly prized, and especially like elite art worlds, or where there's sort of a lot of money and time being spent on this, and originality is seen as really important. So you have this need for distinctiveness, but also people care about the producer themselves. So you have this need for consistency, but also people are expecting this change. So you see this restaurant chefs, especially like elite chefs. So if you go to, like, let's say you just want like a lunch special somewhere, it doesn't have to be a special meal, but if you go to like some Top Chef, this Michelin star restaurant, you're expecting it to be distinctive and have this really unique experience. I think music is a really good idea, a good example. One thing I want to emphasize is this idea of a body of work. I think sociologists tend to, because of various methodologies and interests, either study discrete works or study genres. And I want to focus on this unit of analysis, which is the body of work produced by an artist. And so albums are a really good example where it's pretty similar to like an artist, like a visual artist series, where you have a set of works, or here a set of songs in an album. Like there's some consistency, like there's a theme of the album, but also you expect some consistency with the artist. And so each new album should have, as you said, like this change, but also consistency. And then you have a set of albums and singles that together create the body of work over time. So this is distributed over time. And so that's why temporal judgment, I think, is so important. And one more example I'll give is academia, because this is something we all have, experience with. So like when someone's going on the job market, for instance, you have your CV, your set of projects, which comes with like publications and conference presentations, and it's your job to communicate, this is, okay, these like 3 different projects you see, this is how this is all part of a coherent vision that I have that's distinctive. And here's how I'm going to take this vision in the future as well. And so you can see that each project is distinctive, but it's sort of a node on this trajectory that I'm charting for you. And I'm also going to show how that's going to extend into the future.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so I've got another question here from Brongman, who asks, how would you see the relationship between your findings and our received concepts of sort of high and low art, and if there is any?
Yeah, so I think this is more important in high art worlds, not because that art is inherently better, requires more experimentation or anything like that, but just because the audience, first of all, like the originality is more highly valued when the artist is producing, but also other people expect that more. So like the example of, going to a Top Chef versus like getting a lunch special, you're expecting more originality from that. That's why you're willing to pay that sort of price for that meal. So I think we do see it more intensely in high art worlds.
Well, thank you. All right, one next question I want to ask for is Rachel's. Rachel Skaggs asks about the sort of iconicity and trajectory, maybe tension or balancing, right? Do you see those things as competing forces affecting the creative processes for individual artists, or these separate forces that characterize different social roles in the arts worlds? For example, collectors care more about iconicity, whereas artists care more about trajectory.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I actually saw this as competing forces affecting the creative process, because there's sort of a tension there, I think. So artists, I think, do tend to have a more expansive version of or understanding of their creative vision, because they're the only ones seeing every little shred of what they do, and even the things that aren't materialized, but just their ideas. And then they have to translate that for other people. So while collectors do value both consistency and variation. I do think in general, more pressure is placed on the artist towards consistency because of how collectors work. So collectors view themselves, first of all, as having their own creative vision, which was something I found interesting and was not expecting. But collectors see themselves as creators in that they have a body of work that they accumulate, and they see consistencies within that body of work. They're very intentional about it. They think it's unique and attach their own lived experiences, and they arrange their works in a certain way around their home. They rehang the collection every few months, and they see this as an act of creation, and that they are producing a conversation among a particular set of works. So that's a sort of side note, but collectors are finding works that they see as coherent with their own creative visions as collectors, but also as representing the creative vision of the artist. So collectors will tend to first purchase the most iconic work that they can access, because this is what they view as best epitomizing the creative vision. They will purchase less iconic works, usually only if they already own more iconic works, and then they want to represent the trajectory. So once they're deeply invested in an artist, both aesthetically and economically, then they're trying to chart that trajectory. And if they don't like a particular body of work, they might skip that node and wait for the next one. But they do that when they're particularly invested, and they also do it with works that are low priced, or they call flyers, because this, they feel like they can be like more matching on their idiosyncratic taste. They don't really care both if it goes up in value, what happens to it. They call these works flyers. So every collector has a different threshold for a flyer. So like one collector I talked to said, once it's above $100,000, I really have to think about the investment value. I want to get that most iconic work. If it's 30,000 or below, for me, that's a flyer. It doesn't matter if it retains value. That's just an impulse purchase. So if I see it and I like it, I'll add it to my collection, even if it's not so iconic.
That's interesting. Well, and it leads to a question from Carol, who, when I first read this, it started about, her, she's asking, who then is an artist? And I thought she was going to go in one direction, if you've got collectors and dealers involved in the creative process, then doesn't that actually give them a role in? Now she's asking something much more interesting. So she's asking, what about people who make artworks but don't or can't show that they have this creative vision? Is the creative vision primarily or fundamentally important to positioning an artist in the market?
Yeah, so it is. I mean, it is in at different places in the career. So it matters in different ways as you progress in your career. So if you don't show that you have a creative vision, that's the primary criteria for getting a gallery exhibition. So if people think there's nothing unique about this, there's nothing interesting, you don't have a creative vision yet, then you're not going to get an exhibition opportunity, at least not based on your aesthetic value. So early on in the career, having something that's recognizable as a distinctive creative vision is the most important. And at this point in the career, you're mostly going for group shows. So you'll only have the chance to show one or two artworks in general. So you don't have a chance to show range in your creative vision. You can just show, this is what's distinctive about my creative vision. And at that point in the career, you really have to show something. Usually people go for something that's visually distinctive, like an unusual media or something like that is kind of common, because that's the easiest way to show distinctiveness. Then as artists progress, they might get a solo show, string together a couple solo shows. That's at the point where now they have to show not only distinctiveness, but also trajectory, because you can't have the same show over and over. So now they're starting to show some range, but they're not well known enough that someone's like, this is your iconic thing, right? They're still sort of developing how people see iconicity for them. And then, as they become more and more established, people have more solidified perceptions of what is iconic. So you saw that with the case of Bernhard, who's a pretty established artist and really struggled to do something that people thought was not iconic. And at that point, they have to decide, do I deviate from what's seen as iconic, often because people will be bored, or do I keep doing this because it's selling? And that's a really tough thing for artists, because the artists who I think feel the most free later on in their careers are those who manage to make consistent elements around something that's more conceptual and broad versus a narrow visual consistency. But that's really hard to do because it's hard to get recognized for that. So it's easier to get recognized for a narrow formal consistency, but then that's also the thing that can trap you more later on. And to be recognized for a broad broad thematic thing like the idea of domesticity is really difficult, even though that can be more freeing later on.
That's interesting. And partly it gets at my question about generalization, where a lot of the generalizability question was lateral to other art worlds. I'm actually considering more sort of downstream or lower end, because you focused on real high end part of this art world. And it gets at, I think Carol's follow-up question is, if you don't get a show, does that mean you don't qualify? You don't get to be an artist? Because I wonder if the opportunities that come from iconicity also constrain one's freedom to experiment. And people who don't have a body of work or not a known body of work have very few constraints on experimentation, because they can't violate what we all know about them because no one knows about this person.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Piece.
I think it's more, like those people are more sort of economically free from constraint. I don't know how much more like aesthetically free from constraint they are, because I've talked to people that are like more, they would consider themselves either like craftspeople or hobbyists, where they're like, well, I just like paint for fun. And I've been doing this for 30 years, but I do see myself as having a creative vision. And so maybe it's more broad, yeah, but it I think goes back to this idea of the narratives of creativity. People don't just value the creative vision for like the economic payoff, right? Like it's also, they like really are invested in this idea that you should have an aesthetic commitment to certain things that are, and that aesthetic commitment has to do with like your lived experience, your identity. It comes out from your sort of like unique perspective of the world. And so you need that to like, why, if you don't have that, like, what are you trying to communicate to the world through your art? But like also you should be willing to keep evolving that through experimentation. So there's these aesthetic reasons for it that then become economic justifications, but don't go away when you take away the economic side.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, I want to jump over to a question that Ellen Lutz had asked about, so maybe this is just something, whether you've encountered it through your field work. How do artists deal with the experience or an observation of their experimentation coming close to another artist's work or vision?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So in the contemporary art world, and I think this is something that makes the contemporary art world somewhat distinctive from other art worlds, genre has become less important over time, and the creative vision has become more important. That's because several art historical moves, but basically after minimalism, it was no longer, there's some organizational features like artists being represented by galleries versus like art academies, royal academies, where they're like imitating masters. So now they have to have an individual style. But then art historically also, after minimalism, we were no longer clear on what was more avant-garde. And there was sort of a breakdown in the avant-garde, like, and just a hodgepodge of styles that people drew from. So people don't primarily situate themselves within a genre, but instead say, these are my references. And they might reference genres or artists or themes without saying like, I'm squarely situated within this genre. So where they see themselves overlapping with other artists is on like references or on certain elements. I'm trying to like, I don't remember like a point in my field work where people were like, this is a problem because this looks too much like this. I mean, collectors sometimes said derivative was like the word that collectors used to say that like this was what this other artist did. Usually it was a historical figure where it was like that's already been done 20 years ago. So that definitely happened. I'd say so more so I'm thinking about this as I'm talking about it, like this accusation came from other people more than coming from artists. And what I heard from artists was like, oh yeah, like we both use like cotton swabs, but like the work looks very different. Often artists who felt like they were overlapping on an element would be in a group show together. And so that was like a way to bring together artists that had a common element without this this sort of accusation of it being like the same. Yeah, so that's sort of how I saw people dealing with it. But it actually, this idea of like copying among artists, like I think that's a major thing among some other art worlds, like comedians. Joke theft is like a major issue. Pat Riley has written really amazing stuff on this. But artistic theft or copying was just not something that artists concern themselves with. And that's interesting. I'll have to think about more like why that wasn't a primary concern.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, we've got time. I'm going to sneak in one other question. It's actually a comment from Molly Burke that's really nice. So if you get a chance, make sure you look at it in the chat. But I'm going to turn it into a question, which is really how would you take what your findings are and use that to inform arts programs and how we train future visual or other artists?
Oh, that's a really nice comment. Thank you. So I think if there's like one thing I would say, it's like maybe a slightly cautionary tale, which is that I think artists sometimes are not enough aware of how the aesthetic choices they make early in their career have reverberating effects for potentially decades. And so there is this, so like making something visually recognizable is like really important to getting your foot in the door. But then it's extremely important to vary that. And I think as hard as it is to try to assert conceptual consistencies as something that brings together your body of work, and even as you want to maintain some visually recognizable elements, to also vary other formal elements so that later on in the career, you can change your body of work. Because you know, as I discussed in a chapter of my book, like once artists reach that established point, they can face really difficult choices if they become known for a formally narrow iconic work. And it's really difficult to do because even when artists do make other series, it's somewhat out of their control. Like they might make other series that, you know, because they're less iconic, the dealer doesn't want to show it at this gallery, it shows at a lesser known gallery, or because it's less iconic, people don't buy it as much, and then it becomes less visible. So even if they do make that, it's hard to like create multiple different series that look really different, that maintain a level of visibility where people see iconicity in as really more complex and broad and on a theoretical level versus a formal level. But as much as possible to try to assert these conceptual consistencies and broaden the formal elements that are seen as iconic, because later in the career, if someone doesn't do that, then they have to decide, am I going to weave together pipe cleaners for the next 20 years because I'm known as the pipe cleaner guy, or am I going to do something else and lose my sales and gallery representation?
Excellent. Thank you, Hannah. Let's everyone give a Nice little virtual round of applause to our
Thank you so much
speaker.
for having me. I really enjoyed this discussion. And it's so nice to talk to people who are involved in the arts and interested in this. So I really appreciated being here.
It's great stuff. Go out and buy the book. I feel like a night show talk show host or something. Go get the book now and come back, everyone else, in 2 weeks. We have Amy Whitaker as our next speaker. And anyone who's doing work related to systemic injustices and inequality in the arts and cultural world, take a look for our call for papers we've got out as well. Those are my only plugs. But with that, I'll just say thank you to everyone for attending. Much appreciated. See you in a fortnight.